Our next speaker, Dr. Sana Al-Khatib from Duke, will be discussing the topic of, we'll be discussing this, and the title of our presentation will be Systemic Anticoagulation. How do you select which drug and for whom?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and first I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this meeting for putting this great program together and for inviting me to participate. As you heard, my mission today is to talk about systemic anticoagulation for atrial fibrillation. How do you select which drug for whom? I have no financial relationships with industry, but I have to point out that I was the co-chair of the clinical events committee for the Aristotle trial that looked at apixaban, which is one of the novel oral anticoagulants. That trial was published in 2011. So I'm pretty sure that everybody here knows that atrial fibrillation is a major public health problem, not only in this country, but also globally. It is estimated that the lifetime risk of atrial fibrillation is 25%. Up to 4 million Americans have atrial fibrillation, and tens of millions of people have atrial fibrillation worldwide. And it is well known that 15 to 20% of all strokes are due to atrial fibrillation. AF increases the stroke risk 5-fold in the general population of patients with AFib and 7-fold in patients who have congestive heart failure. And when you look at the data on oral anticoagulation, we see a lot of hope there because we know that anticoagulants reduce the risk of stroke by 60 to 65%. Unfortunately, about half of patients at risk of stroke are being treated with an oral anticoagulant. In the US, it's estimated that about 50,000 preventable strokes per year exist. And so when we clinicians see patients with atrial fibrillation and we need to make a decision about whether to treat them with antithrombotic therapy, we weigh the risk for embolic events against the risk for side effects, and of course the most dreaded one is intracranial bleeding. We also have to take into account the patient's quality of life, their preferences, and any cost implications. So warfarin has been around for a long time. And the good news is that warfarin is very effective at preventing stroke. So if you look actually at pooled data from 6 randomized clinical trials, you see that Coumadin can actually reduce the risk of stroke by 64%. There aren't too many therapies in medicine in general that can produce this kind of effect. The bad news is that warfarin is not used well, and this is primarily because of the challenges associated with the use of this medication. And in fact, we have seen data that came out of the Get With The Guidelines database that showed that patients who needed to be on warfarin, a good number of them weren't. Close to 30, up to 40% of patients were not on it, and look at patients with CHADS-2 score of 6. Again, about 40% of those patients were not on a warfarin. But again, most likely that's because those patients are usually at the highest risk of bleeding. So something to keep in mind. And we actually saw similar findings from other studies and other analyses. This is one of them here. So there's no question that we actually could do better when it comes to stroke prevention in patients with atrial fibrillation. So what are the challenges? Of course, there's a big concern about the risk of major bleeding and intracranial bleeding in patients on warfarin. And this slide here shows you the risk of major bleeding in patients by age. And as expected, patients who are older usually have a higher risk of bleeding, but it's actually not insignificant in either patient age group. And as many of you know, we have to deal with all the warfarin food and warfarin drug interactions that are numerous. It's definitely hard to keep up. And of course, you have the need to continue to monitor the PT-INR on a regular basis. And so there are a lot of challenges involved in the use of warfarin. And in fact, in the Averroes trial that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine comparing aspirin with apixaban in patients who were deemed to be unsuitable for a vitamin K antagonist, they actually did report on the different reasons for why these patients were deemed to be unsuitable. And you'll see here that the INR could not or unlikely to be measured at appropriate intervals present in 43% of the patients. You'll see patient refusal accounting for 38%. And actually, if you look at their group of patients, you'll see